The Sustainable Forages webinar and podcast is a series of informative and engaging conversations about sustainable forage production and management practices. Each episode features experts and innovators in the field discussing a range of topics, including soil health, grazing management, and the latest research on forage crops. Whether you're a farmer, rancher, or just interested in sustainable agriculture, this series is a valuable resource for anyone looking to learn more about the importance of forages in a sustainable food system.
All right, well, I'm Grant Lastuca, and we're so fortunate to have Courtney, who is Courtney O'Keefe, who with Blue Rock Animal Nutrition, nutritionist there for 7 years now, and previously did her master's at the University of Saskatchewan, looking at maturities of cereal crops for silage and for grain. Courtney is a board member of the Alberta Forage Industry Network, so we're drawing on one of our own. We kind of feel pretty spoiled here to have her on our team. But this project work that has been ongoing now is exciting because, as everybody knows, forages across this province are pretty varying, and some of this data I trust will apply to other provinces even as we look across the zones. So we're going to ask Courtney to share what they've found so far and the magnitude of the experiment they're carrying out to get the data so that you'll better understand and get the meaning from her presentation. So Courtney, I'm going to let you take it away.
Alrighty, sounds good. Can everybody hear me okay?
Perfect.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thanks for the introduction and the invitation to come out tonight, Grant. So like he had said, I'm going to share with you guys kind of some of our preliminary results. So 2 years worth of data of our Alberta Pasture project here at Blue Rock. I do want to acknowledge a few of our kind of collaborators. So Ardar has been a big funding part of this project for the last year 2 and year 3. And also Farming Forward had partnered with us. AFIN has partnered with us, so that's why they're hosting us tonight. Foothills Forage, Grey Wooded Forage Association, LARA are kind of the other associations that have partnered with us. We've done quite a few extension events kind of over the last year and a half trying to share this data with everybody out there. All right. There we go. So a bit of background as to why, why is this even important to us? Why are we worried about this? So as many of you guys know, nutrient content of the vegetation is dependent on many things. So we do know that nutrient content of the soil is a big factor. So you guys can see over here on the right-hand side of the screen is a map of Alberta showing all the different soil zones that we have. So it definitely varies quite a bit going from north to south, east to west, over the different zones. So geographical regions plays a really big impact on the nutrient content of the soil, which can impact the different nutrient content of the forage then. Also, history of the land is really important to know. So whether the land has been cropped, how heavily it's been fertilized, or if it's been fertilized at all, how often, with what product. So certain products applied can change the certain nutrient contents as well. In Alberta, we definitely have had oil and gas activity in the past and present, so we know that that can really impact the level of sulfur in some of our forages in some of those areas. Grass species is also really important, which I'm not going to talk about individual grass species in this study in particular. We kind of looked at things as an average of the different pastures across the province. So, but we do know, for example, legumes can differ in nutrient content into comparison to other grasses, as well as weather patterns. So many of you guys know the last couple of years have been very challenging with lack of moisture that can really change the conditions of our pastures fairly quickly and fairly drastically as well. So hopefully this year is a little different and we have a little bit more moisture to kind of keep us rolling and keep the quality kind of headed in the right direction. And then another part of this as well is that, so Alberta Agriculture last collected kind of grass data set from the years 1984 to 1994. So that was almost 30 years ago. So that was definitely a big push for us to kind of update this data set so we can use it in our daily practices every day working with producers to help make the best decisions that we can. And then also technology has come a long way. So we do know that our technology has improved in how we can analyze these samples. So the quality of the samples that were analyzed were, you could say, as the years progressed, the technology has. So we're a little bit more confident possibly in some of the data. And so kind of with that in mind, the questions that we asked ourselves for this particular study was, so us as a group in Blue Rock there, the 4 of us nutritionists, Lee, Kristen, Abby, and myself, we kind of sat down and we had kind of 3 main objectives. And the first was, can one product fit the nutrient requirements of all cattle throughout the province?
No.
When is a salt product, say, no longer meeting the nutrient requirements of these animals? And then when are protein and energy no longer meeting requirements, and how much supplementation is necessary? So this is going to definitely be farm and ranch specific based off of when you're calving, the type of cattle you have, where you live, things like that. So for majority of producers, I would say it's been very common ground that a lot of guys just feed blue cobalt salt. And some just feed a trace mineral salt, and some feed a full mineral package all summer long. So the idea is that we're setting out to kind of answer these questions as to, you know, what is the best answer for individual producers in certain areas throughout the province, and to really nail down, you know, one product may not be the best for an area in southeastern location in the province like Medicine Hat in comparison to Lacrete up in the north. So what we were doing, we had to start off, so this is a map here kind of behind. We had 7 different locations for our year 1 and year 2. And so we were up in the Lacrete area, Manning area, we were around Mayerthorpe and Barhead, west of the 2 at Rocky Mountain House, Caroline area. We were east of the 2 around Pine Lake, Red Deer area, kind of in there on the east side of the 2 there. Then we did venture further east to Hanna and Youngstown. And in the southwest corner, we were down in that Natin country as well. So that was year 1. And then year 2, we reached out for a little bit more funding to get a little bit more help. So we were able to kind of expand our scope of practice. So we then expanded into the southeast corner. So I was out gathering samples in that Medicine Hat Walsh area, as well as we went up around Smoky Lake, St. Paul area as well. So what we did is we were sampling 3 different times throughout the year. So depending kind of year to year, it was close, but varied a little bit. So it was either end of May, early June, within a 2-week period. And then we also sampled again in end of July, early August, and then end of September, early October, kind of depending on the year and how the forages were progressing. And so in each area, we had 3 producers kindly volunteer 3 pastures to us. So per area, we sampled 9 pastures. And it was a mix of some pastures were tame, some were native. We weren't picky, just whichever pastures those producers utilized as grazing areas for themselves kind of throughout the summer months. And again, like each sampling period, I just want to kind of amplify is that we really tried to keep it within that 2-week period. So there wasn't much variation. It was just Abby and myself traveling the province grabbing these samples. So it took a bit of time, but we were able to get it all done.
Very well in the southern Alberta.
And then
It's like a spear grass.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, what was that?
We just cows, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
when it gets enough rain.
Yeah.
And then in the we also
Please, could you mute your mic if you're not asking a question, or use chat, please? Thank you. Sorry, Courtney.
No, all good. And yeah, feel free to stop me at any time as well if there's something that pops up as we go through. And then so this year we'll be starting our 3rd and final year of the project. Abby and I will be going out here and within 2 weeks starting to grab our first samples throughout the different areas throughout the province. And then too, when we were out there, we actually, at each site, kind of each sampling period, we did our best to really kind of stage the grasses as well. So to have a good idea if we were at a vegetative state, elongation, or if we were already in a reproductive state. So that was something that happened every time that we went out sampling. And then when we got the samples gathered and back, we sent everything obviously for a lab analysis. So we did a combination of NIR and wet chemistry. So NIR was one method we used at the lab for our fibers and our energy and protein, and our minerals were done all by wet chemistry. And then when we interpreted the results, we made sure we were just interpreting everything on our dry matter basis. And then we use A&L Canada Labs as kind of our primary lab for most of our samples. We did use Caro as well up in Edmonton for some of our selenium samples. I forgot to list them here on this slide. And so what we measured when we got these samples back, we were analyzing energy, protein, the different fiber components, so ADF, NDF, lignin, our different macro minerals, so calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sulfur, sodium, and our trace minerals. So we had copper, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, iron, and selenium. So we definitely were trying to get a whole picture of what we had for the different pastures throughout the province. And this slide here is just to show you guys just some pictures, basically, of the different pastures. So you can see we have Hannah, Nanton, Lacrete, Manning, St. Paul. So definitely some variability between the pastures. And these were all sampled in that first sampling period within 2 weeks last year. So you can definitely see the variation from, say, Hannah to St. Paul into the stage of those grasses and where they were at. And also, so there's variation obviously from geographical region, but the other interesting thing too was within each area, like, so we have 2 pictures of Lacrete here, is actually very different, some of the pastures within that individual area. So that's something to keep in mind, that it definitely can vary throughout the province, and the conditions can change things very quickly. These are, again, just some more pictures from out sampling. So we have Rocky Mountain House here on the top left in comparison, say, to Medicine Hat from the east side of the province, or from the east to the west, and then Mayerthorpe to Red Deer, so a little bit further north to a little bit further south. So Mayerthorpe was quite dry last year as well. So just to kind of give you guys a bit of a snapshot of what some of the pastures look like when we were out sampling. And then I do like to just show you guys, oh, sorry, Grant, to see your question here. Did you keep native and tame separate and legumes? So we did, basically, so each pasture, depending if the producer, if we called it a native pasture, that was sampled as one. And if it was, say, a tame pasture, it was sampled as a tame. So majority of the pastures, I would say, didn't have many legumes in there. If there was some legumes, there would have been some brought in. So we tried to just take a good representative sample of what we had, if that makes sense for you. And then, so this, sorry, I'll try to keep tab of the questions as well, you guys. So this slide here is just to show you guys kind of the Mulder's chart. I just like to show it just to show the complexity of mineral nutrition. So a lot of these minerals are kind of intertwined with each other. A lot of them can act as antagonists, or they work synergistically with others. So just know that it is kind of a complicated thing, kind of working within mineral nutrition as a whole. And then when you're thinking of nutrient requirements for the beef cow, so as we're going through these results throughout the rest of the presentation, just kind of keeping in mind where your operation is at, if you have cattle at home or sheep, that you know, things change as you kind of go through the different stage in gestation or where they're at in lactation. So for many producers, you know, some who are calving this spring might only be a month or 2 out from calving, or some are calving right now. So at peak lactation, we are targeting around that 65% for TDN and 11% for protein. And you can see as we kind of move away from calving and through the summer months, our requirements do start to come down a bit. And then they would be at their lowest kind of right at the end, early fall, end of the late summer there, as you're weaning those cattle, and you'd be around that 50 to 55 for TDN and a minimum of 7% protein. So So just to kind of give you guys a bit of a visual of what we need to keep in mind for energy and protein requirements of those beef cows. All right, so for our energy and protein results, so I've kind of grouped them on slides, you guys will see. So for total digestible nutrients, this is our energy. And so I'll go through that slide, this graph first. So you guys can see the gray line. So this linear line here, this is representing the requirement for mid-gestation for a pregnant cow. And the blue line is showing the requirement for a cow at peak lactation. So she just calved. So basically that's at 65 and 55. So you guys can see kind of there is a trend definitely. So in June, which is the blue bar, so our first sampling period, and August would be our second sampling period, and the gray bar would be October, so our early fall, our last sampling period. You can see that basically across the board through all regions, we're seeing a decrease in energy as that plant matures, which is what we expected to see. Certain areas basically were able to meet the requirements pretty well all the way through. Some areas like Medicine Hat seem to be struggling a little bit in energy content in some of the forages there. It was quite dry and a bit dire down there last year when we were sampling, so it'll be interesting to see what year 2 does for them this year. And then again, looking at our crude protein, so again, the gray bar is mid-gestation requirements and the blue bar is lactation. So you can see that we got lots of protein here in the pastures, especially early on here. We're upwards of 16% in some areas. And typically we're seeing that trend too again. As that forage matures, we're starting to see a decline in protein, which is what we would expect as that plant would mature. And again, so this basically would kind of give us the idea of more of a generalization, I would say. It's not going to give us a blanket statement of what's happening for energy and protein throughout to use as a blanket across the whole province. So just keep in mind, each individual operation is a little bit different as to where you're at, as to whether or not you would say be using a supplementation strategy or not. And then I also wanted to show you guys a graph on neutral detergent fiber. So neutral detergent fiber is essentially the fiber portion. So it'd be hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin that represents essentially the bulkiness of the feed. So when this gets too high, cattle just can't physically eat enough to kind of get what they need out of the nutrients of the feed. So you guys can see, so typically we like to stay for a mature cow less than that 60% mark. And so you can see that throughout basically all regions, we're pretty well below that. And we are seeing a trend of, as that forage matures and we move through the season, we are seeing an increase in NDF, which would be what we would expect again as that plant matures and things dry down. We're seeing more fiber laid down in the stem of the plant. So just keep that in mind. Really, the only couple that really gave us issues of really being higher in NDF and possibly being a little bit high, that maybe look at a bit of supplementation, especially for protein, was that Medicine Hat area and possibly Hannah in that early fall time of the year. Then for acid detergent fiber, so this is a portion of the fiber that essentially represents the digestibility of the feed. And so forages that are less than 40% are considered good quality, so they're very digestible. So when we're seeing kind of a similar trend that as we move from this early spring into the fall, we're seeing an increase in ADF, which is kind of what we've expected as well. So the digestibility of the feed starts to go down as the quality starts to go down as well. And so for calcium and phosphorus, so kind of how I'm going to highlight the minerals for you guys is I'll kind of go through some key points to keep in mind for each of them, and then we'll go through the results. So for calcium, the requirement in the diet is 0.3% on a dry matter basis. So forages are typically a very good source of calcium. Legumes are higher in comparison to certain grasses, typically what we'll see. Cattle actually have the ability to handle a fairly high amount of dietary calcium. So they can really, where we start to maybe see some issues with decrease in dry matter intake is around that 1% of calcium total in the diet. And so where we see some really more so some of the bigger issues of this macro mineral would be when we have low blood calcium levels, and essentially you'd see milk fever in a cow go down due to lower levels of calcium in the diet, which typically in these scenarios on pasture, we aren't seeing that in comparison to some of the winter months. But it is just something to keep in mind. And for phosphorus, so the requirement in the diet is 0.2% of the dry matter on a dry matter basis. I thought this was interesting from McDowell 2003 that they had listed that phosphorus deficiency is the most prevalent mineral deficiency in the world. So it's definitely kind of a worldwide issue. And so cattle have the ability to store a large reserve of phosphorus in their bones. But where we run into issues is if we're not able to replenish those levels of phosphorus, and they're basically taking away without adding more phosphorus back, is where we're going to run into a deficiency. And so some of the deficiency issues that we'll see is related to a decrease in growth rates, impaired reproduction, decrease in milk production. So those are the minerals that kind of individually there, but a lot of times too, we think of calcium and phosphorus kind of as a team. So it is a balance of a ratio between the two. So it is important that we keep a ratio of at least 2 to 1. So 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus, and on the high end of a 7 to 1. So it's important that we kind of keep that balance between calcium and phosphorus in order for the metabolism of both to be working kind of as best as it can within the animal. So you guys can see, oh, there we go. Just a few comments, that's good. And so for calcium and phosphorus, so for calcium, you guys can see, so again, the red line is our requirement. So we're at 0.3 for requirement. So we have lots of calcium pretty well across the board in most of the areas. Where we're a little bit lower is Hannah and Medicine Hat. But we are seeing kind of that similar trend from the spring, early spring to later fall. We do see an increase in calcium in those forages. So again, not much supplementation of calcium is really necessarily needed per se, but phosphorus is a bit of a different story. So you guys can see the requirement for phosphorus here is 0.2. Early off in the spring, a majority of the areas, we looked pretty good. We had plenty of phosphorus in the diet, but things definitely drastically changed as we kind of move through the season. So you could see basically we're deficient in all areas in that early fall, late summer, and even some in the middle of the summer there, we were starting to see some areas that were very low on phos, and these areas were very dry. So just keep in mind that these drought conditions and forage maturity can play a really big role in decreasing these phosphorus levels in the plant. I keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. And so yeah, so just keep in mind basically too that we have a bit of a calcium and phosphorus, potentially an issue here. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I go over the ratios here. So over the last 2 years, in period 1, so that would have been our May sampling, our ratio ranged from 1.3 to 2.2. So we were possibly a little bit on the lower end, certain times of the year to adequate. And then you're seeing basically our cal-phos ratio is increasing as we move into the fall months. And the big difference there would be coming from, we have higher amounts of calcium coming into that grass and a decreasing amount of phosphorus. So our balance, our ratio between the two is starting to become out of whack. So this was a consistent trend basically across all of the areas through the province. So just a reminder that we want to make sure that we're at a 2 to 1 to a 7 to 1. So keeping that ratio, that we're within that limit, that would be perfect. Whether or not we need to say add in some phosphorus into the diet or calcium to kind of make that work. And so why this is actually really important too is so phosphorus, so dical is actually one of the more expensive ingredients to add in a mineral. So if you guys don't necessarily need it in certain periods, certain times of the year, then that's a good way to be able to kind of make an economical decision to take it out as well. And so for magnesium and potassium, so for magnesium, the requirement in the diet is 0.15 to 0.2 on a dry matter basis. So this is critical for muscle function, milk production. a large portion of the magnesium in a cow is stored in her bones. So about that 65 to 70%, so a huge amount. So again, similar to phosphorus, if we're not able to replenish those levels of magnesium in the bone, coming from the diet or supplementation, that's when we can run into problems. So the rumen is the major site for magnesium absorption here. And so a deficiency scenario is when we typically run into low magnesium in the blood plasma. And so more so this spring, over the next few weeks, if you'll be turning out, you could be seeing issues with, say, a grass tetany scenario, or in the winter months, they would call it winter tetany. And so for potassium, the requirement in the diet is 0.6%. Forages are typically an excellent source of potassium. Usually we're ranging between 1 to 4%. And as that forage matures, typically our potassium content will decrease. And so something to keep in mind kind of as well is that high dietary potassium will decrease magnesium absorption in the animal. So this is where we can kind of run into problems. So our tetany ratio, what I briefly mentioned before, is basically it's a balance between potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And so we want to target the ratio to be less than 2.2. That will decrease the risk of seeing tetany issues of cows going down to that. So sometimes when we run into issues is high potassium and not enough calcium and not enough magnesium in the diet, and you'll see an issue with a cow go down with tetany. So some of our results from the first 2 years there, you guys can see on the left, the magnesium requirement here, I went off of 0.15. So there really isn't much of a trend. It's kind of all over the place, honestly, in the different locations throughout the province. Some areas were adequate in magnesium. So it seemed like further north, we seem to be a little bit higher in magnesium in comparison to Hannah and Medicine Hat. Again, we were quite low in magnesium in some of these areas. That'd be a little bit concerned turning cattle out first thing in the spring. And especially just something to keep in mind this spring, I'd say, like over the last week and a half to 2 weeks, we've definitely seen some moisture. So it's ranged anywhere from 1 to 4 inches of rain, I've heard, kind of throughout the province. So definitely with that kind of bit of moisture and then that burst of growth coming from that lush grass, you could see an issue with grass tetany as well. And then also, so on the right hand side here are potassium levels. So you guys can see the requirement is 0.6%. And you can see basically there's lots of potassium in pretty well all areas throughout the province. And there is a similar trend again, like basically the literature is showing that as that forage matures or we have issues with drought, we're going to see that potassium level decrease. So earlier in the spring months, we have quite a bit of potassium. So some were as high as 2.75. And then we'll see it quite drop right back down to less than 0.5 in the fall months. So this basically is just kind of, I would say, just kind of hitting that point home that earlier in the spring, our risk for tetany would be a little bit higher due to the higher levels of potassium in the forage. But as we move through the summer, the risk would decrease as that calcium, especially that calcium level, is coming up, and same with the magnesium is slightly coming up, and then potassium is going down. So again, we calculated our tetany ratio over a 2-year period. And so kind of our early spring period, we were at a 0.9 to 2.5. So mostly okay. There were some with an increased risk potentially without any additional supplementation. And then all the way through to the fall, basically the risk kind of went away. So it was consistent across the province as we moved through the grazing season. And just a reminder that we want that tetany ratio to be less than 2.2. So for sulfur, when we think of sulfur, we think of the requirement in the diet being 0.15%. And sulfur, sometimes I feel like is forgotten, but it is really critical for rumen, for the microbes in the rumen for digestion, for protein synthesis. And so also keep in mind that certain fertilizers can impact the level of sulfur concentrations in the forage. So ammonium sulfate, we can see increased levels of sulfur Same with our oil and gas activity. In certain areas of the province, we can see higher levels of sulfur because of that. One other thing to keep in mind that it'll be interesting to see in the data next here is that so sulfur and molybdenum actually compete for the same transporter site in the root of the plant. So we'll see kind of the levels will interchange. In the spring, sulfur will be a little bit higher, and in the fall, molybdenum will be a little bit higher. And often this was just kind of a point to put in because we get asked about fly control for, say, garlic or sulfur. And the kind of the jury's out on that still. There is some literature showing that the sulfur component in the garlic that potentially can have some insect repelling abilities. So just keep in mind that's kind of where that theory is coming from. And so for our results here for sulfur, again, a requirement at 0.15. It's a similar trend basically across all areas of the province. We're starting off with quite a bit of sulfur in the diet, still within safe levels. So in a forage diet, sorry, I did not illustrate that, where we can run into issues on more of a toxic level, you'd be up in that 0.45 to 0.5. In more of a higher grain scenario, that 0.3 would be considered a toxic level in the diet. So we're safe, though we're not near high enough on any of our sulfur levels throughout the spring or the fall. But there is a similar trend basically that as we move through the grazing season, we're seeing a decrease in sulfur. And so only certain periods of the year, I would say, it would be necessary to supplement sulfur. So probably in that late fall, early fall, late fall, later summer, depending on the conditions, you could think about adding in some sulfur into your mineral program. And then I'll be talking about copper and molybdenum. So copper, the requirement to keep in mind in the diet is 10 milligrams per kilogram on a dry matter basis. Again, legumes are typically higher in comparison to our grasses. Copper deficiency, so kind of a similar trend here with some of our deficiencies. We can have reproductive failure, so higher open rates. In some animals, we can see that red tinge of the coat, so it'd be more visibly seen in black cattle potentially, and as well as decreased growth rates in yearlings can be seen. And then talking about molybdenum, so this typically is not supplemented in the diet. Additionally, usually we get enough in the forages. Usually we're dealing with issues with too much molybdenum in some scenarios. And so the forages vary in molybdenum level depending on the soil type and soil pH. We have seen some in previous years when we've sampled some pastures, and some of the data shows that higher moisture years we can see higher levels of molybdenum. And it is a known antagonist to copper, so it can tie up copper and make it unavailable to the animal. So that's why it is important that we keep a 6-to-1 copper to moly ratio in the diet at all times. So here's the graph just showing the copper level. You can see this is our requirement, and it's a pretty obvious trend across the board that we're deficient basically at all times of the year. So copper needs to be supplemented year round. Obviously, we're seeing in the spring maybe a little bit higher, and a decrease as that plant matures, but it's still not enough. So keep in mind, copper needs to be supplemented at all times. For our molybdenum, you guys can see, so I guess I didn't point out, I'll go back to sulfur quick, that earlier in the months in the spring, our sulfur level was higher. So this is also when a lot of protein is being put down in the plant. So sulfur is being utilized to build protein within that plant. So the molybdenum, then you can see earlier in the spring we're lower. There's a bit of a trend here, and then we'll see an increase in moly as we move through the summer months and into later in the season and early in the fall. So there's a switch basically in that transporter site within the root. This later in the fall will become molybdenum's turn to be part of the plant metabolism. And so St. Paul, it seemed like, was definitely St. Paul and our Caroline and Rocky areas were quite high in moly, that we were starting to be concerned that the level of copper in the diet wasn't high enough. And if you weren't feeding the proper type of copper, like an organic source or a chelated source, those animals weren't going to be getting the benefit to feeding the copper that you were feeding. So where we started to kind of get worried about it was over that 3 mark, I would say was considered high from molybdenum. And so for zinc and manganese, so zinc, the requirement in the diet is 30 milligrams per kilogram. Again, legumes are higher. They seem to be higher in most minerals. And a large portion of zinc in plants is held within the cell wall, which is difficult for that animal then to utilize to get it actually out of the cell wall. And so for what we'll see for deficiency, you'll see typically poor hoof health. So you might see some more foot rot issues. Again, reproductive performance can be impaired, which seems to be, again, a common theme all the way through. For manganese, the requirement is a little bit higher at 40 milligrams per kilogram in the diet. So high dietary calcium and phosphorus, as well as iron, can actually interfere with manganese absorption within the animal. So sometimes too much calcium can cause an issue with how that manganese will be absorbed. So forages typically, and you guys will see this, is that on paper they're adequate, but the question is the availability. I feel like us as a team, we've talked kind of endlessly about manganese lately. So it is just something to keep in mind that it might be there, but it maybe isn't fully available for that animal to utilize. And as for deficiency, skeletal deformities in young animals, so for calves at birth sometimes can be an issue. Again, reproductive failure, abortion, stillbirth, so can cause some problems when we don't have enough manganese in the diet. So for zinc, again, here's the requirement at 30. You can see basically across the board, for the most part, we're deficient in zinc in pretty well all areas throughout the province. La Crete seemed to be kind of the outlier where they were a little bit higher in zinc in some of their forages up there. But just know too that there is a reduced efficiency in absorption when there is that interaction between zinc and other metal ions like iron. So to keep that in mind as to, even though it might be there, it might not be utilized. And so for manganese is a different story. You guys can see the requirement here, our line is at 40. And across the board, on paper, it looks like we have enough manganese present. But again, the question is, it's there, but is it available? So some of the literature shows that the estimates for manganese absorption ranges from 6 to 11%. And so if we have higher levels of calcium, phosphorus, potassium or iron in the diet, that can also impact how that manganese is absorbed. And so for selenium, the requirement here, the literature shows, is 0.1% on a dry matter basis. And the selenium content of the soil can play a huge role in the forage level, which many of us know and have known for a long, long time. Typically, selenium isn't included on your average feed test. It is something that you'd have to additionally request. I would say it's more so due to cost as to why it's not done more so on the daily basis. And just keep in mind that your vitamin E and selenium are interrelated, so they work together. When one's deficient, usually the other one is. And so for deficiency, I'm sure over the years, many of you have seen white muscle disease in our newborns and our calves or our kids or lambs. That's a sure sign of selenium deficiency. Reproductive failure, again, retained placentas. And we do on occasion see issues with toxicity. So the max tolerable level in the diet is 5 milligrams per kilogram of selenium on a dry matter basis. So I would say this is less likely, but there are pockets. So throughout the province, up north and into BC and northern BC, there's some areas up there that struggle with high selenium in the soil that then leads to higher selenium forages. And same even in our southwest corner, I know around Pincher Creek, there's an area in there that struggle with it as well with certain forages that are selenium accumulators. And so here's our data for selenium, which it kind of surprised us a little bit, to be honest. So our selenium was higher in a lot of areas than we thought it was going to be. You guys can see there is a trend though that we're moving, it's higher in the spring and it'll decrease as we move through into the fall. And certain areas like Lacrete, Manning, Mayerthorpe, St. Paul, most of our northern areas were definitely lower in selenium in comparison to some of our east areas. Like Medicine Hat was actually quite high in selenium, and that was interesting to see. So this is the map of Alberta, and my poor drawing, you guys can see the red line going kind of north and south here. This is Highway 2. And so usually kind of the rule of thumb I would say is on the west side of the 2. And so a lot of our gray wooded soils are this way. Usually we're lower in selenium. And on the east side of the 2, we seem to be higher in the amount of selenium that's available in the feed. And then this kind of fork is Highway 1. And you can see that down in this Medicine Hat pocket in the southeast, it was interestingly higher than we thought it was going to be. So still need to supplement selenium because again, the availability in the forage, but it is just something to keep in mind as well, that you might not need to be as high as one originally thought in certain areas. And so just to kind of wrap up for our recommendations to producers based off of this 2 years of data, is that bottom line is just consider the availability of these minerals on pasture as it changes through the season. So just because it's there doesn't mean the animals are utilizing it. I think is a really key point to keep in mind. Trace minerals are deficient pretty well throughout the province. So providing only that blue salt block that our grandpa has always done isn't enough, and I would recommend against that. And at a minimum, I would put in a trace mineral salt should be provided. But again, it's going to vary based on the area that you're at. It changes slightly for what the recommendation should be. Recent rainfall throughout the province has allowed for rapid growth. So like I'd mentioned, just possibly in the next few weeks, if you'll be turning out, just keep in mind grass tetany could be possibly an issue. So maybe you'd be wanting to feed a little bit higher magnesium mineral during your turnout period. And then finally, just kind of producers in that West Country and even up in that Northeast region seem to be, I would say, would have the most benefit in using a chelated copper source because they are struggling with high molybdenum in their feed. So again, just remember those signs of copper deficiency would be low conception rate, poor weight gains, your hair coat looks rough or off, and then just poor immune function as well. So kind of where are we going next with this project and what is the plan? So Abby and I are going to continue sampling here for this summer. So we'll start, like I had said at the beginning, in the next 2 weeks, we'll be out there grabbing grass. And then we'll continue to present to everybody here and give a kind of a final update through presentations and extension documents, things like that. And that's just kind of how we're going to wrap up, I guess, year 3 of the grass study. So with that, I will answer any questions if anybody has any to the best of my ability. So.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Are there any questions in the chat now that Courtney never got to?
Will the recording be sent out? Yeah, Amanda answered that one.
And if you came on later, Courtney's just responding that Amanda said yes, they would be sent out or available on the website.
Yeah, on the AFIN website.
With slides and everything. Yes.
Yeah.
And two, when we do kind of get our final report together, we'll have it in AFIN. Amanda, you'll be able to post it on the website as well too. So we definitely want to get the data out there so people can use it and make decisions with it. So
I had just kind of kept track, and of course It's an area I've had difficulty with in the past and had some help from you guys in addressing. I graze quite a bit of lowland.
Yes.
And with that lowland, how could it be thought of in light of trying to address the needs of animals once they're on it? And in many cases, it's the forages that are growing with drainage and salinity issues and other things, Courtney.
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest key to what I would recommend to Grant, like it would be to grab some samples to know exactly what you're dealing with. As to if say you graze on, like you said, a lot of lowland, you could possibly have some other issues along with it, whether it's high sodium. Sulfur can sometimes be an issue as well. So I would say probably just to do a feed sample would be the basic answer to that, to see exactly with, you know, what you're dealing with, and then to build a plan around that for supplementation strategy to make sure you're not missing anything kind of as you move through the grazing season.
Thank you. Courtney, do you see that next question?
Deborah.
Early spring grazing in tetany.
Yep.
Deborah, do you want to speak
Deborah.
to it?
Deborah, if you want to unmute, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Your mute is on the bottom
Hi.
left
Finally
hand.
found it.
There we go.
Okay.
So question is, in the spring, when we got high grass growth, as in right now,
Yep.
and my cows are out grazing, they're grazing some old grass along with the new grass in most places.
Yep.
But would it be advisable to supplement them with some high legume hay along with that grass that they're getting? Would that be a good way to try and avoid the tetany thing, or?
Yeah, like the big thing to remember with ruminants is that, like, in a perfect world, if you can adapt them onto kind of any new feed that you move on to. So there is definitely a big change moving from a dry feed, so your dry hay, to a lush forage. So there's going to be upset in the rumen no matter what. But if you can try to adapt them on, so transition them over with some feed, sounds like the pasture, with it having some dry feed in there, that will also help kind of transition them over to the new growth, to kind of slow things down. As for a mineral, if you were, say, really concerned, sometimes even topping up with magnesium oxide is something you can pick up to mix in your existing mineral, to increase the level of magnesium available to them. And then also, yeah, like feeding like a higher legume hay if you're running into an issue, is a pretty quick way as well to kind of increase that level of magnesium in the diet fairly quickly. So,
Okay.
so I'd say the answer depends, but if you can transition them over as best as you can, I would say is always best case scenario. Sometimes, I know a lot of times it doesn't happen in the spring. You run out of feed and you kick them out, and that's just the way it is. But with your pastures having some carryover, I would say is also helping kind of slow things down in the rumen through that transition as well. So.
Okay. Might have to come and see you. Thanks.
Sounds good.
So is it right away that the scales would worry about it, or is it going to be in a few days after turnout?
Like typically it would be fairly quick if you're going to run into an issue. So if say you just turned out, it might be within a few days kind of thing. You would see issues kind of within that first week, I would say. If there's going to be an issue, you would see it then.
Okay. Brittany has a question. She's got her hand up.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Courtney. This was a great presentation and very informative. I'm actually an equine nutritionist. I'm currently working on my PhD. But interestingly, this, especially for the mineral deficiencies, really mirrors what I've been seeing in the hay analysis for my clients.
Yep.
And like, especially with the drought this year, I've seen as high as 13-to-1 calcium to phosphorus in my hays. Yeah, I guess you've seen that as well. And yeah, especially that deficiency in the copper and zinc and everything. So that was really interesting. Did you test iodine?
We did not. No, iodine was not tested. So We did, I guess I didn't list, there was sodium on there, which that was deficient across the board.
Yeah.
Iron kind of fluctuated, whether it was high or low.
Okay.
But we didn't test iodine specifically, so, but sorry about that.
No, that's all right. But the selenium is valuable because, as you said, for the cost, I find a lot of clients don't opt for that.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, it is.
But I might reach out to you here and then just via email at some point to connect. But also, did you publish these results at all anywhere?
So the plan is to publish.
Okay.
So we still, and we'll run statistics on when we get kind of our year 3 data gathered. The plan's to run stats on that. That's Abby's job. She'll do that. And then the plan is to publish. Yes. So yeah.
Yeah, I would love to see that publication when you guys get around to it at the end of year 3.
No, perfect. Sounds good.
All right. Thanks so much.
No, thank you for coming.
So some of the data was 2 years combined and some was not, simply because it was just the first year of the those 2 extended eastern Alberta
Yeah, that's
areas.
right. Yeah, so everything, the 7 main areas to start, were 2 years worth of data. And then the Medicine Hat and St. Paul area was just technically 1 year of data because they weren't included in year 1. So so it'll be a bit more robust in those areas. I'm excited to see as we get through this season to see exactly where we're at, you know, how that will change. So
Question with water and some of the dilemmas with drought and diminished water supplies. As you're seeing these forages, I imagine you saw water sources in some of these pastures. Was there another concern being combined in your own minds as you saw water and forage coming together?
yes, definitely. So we definitely, in some areas of the province, you know, most of the province, I should say, water was an issue as the summer progressed. And a lot of those dugouts got fairly low. So you can see an increase, obviously, in those total dissolved solids, and sulfates can be an issue. Blue-green algae is another one too. But I would say that no, definitely that a combination between the water source as well as some of the forage issues that we could see, it could definitely amplify problems. So for sure, yeah. So I would recommend, depending on the conditions and how your water sources look, it is still important to test. I would test those water sources kind of throughout the summer. If we're starting to see, you know, dry conditions or the level of water that you have there isn't adequate enough. Sometimes a lot of those mineral contents seem to be almost concentrated when we're in drier conditions. So it's good to know into how you can supplement to kind of mitigate if there is an issue. So
Where would you take water samples to, Courtney, if you were going to?
for sure. Actually, A&L can do a livestock panel as well. So I'd send it. A&L would be an option. Even any health unit, most of those you can send off for a mineral panel as well. So yeah.
For livestock.
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
But I would say A&L has been primarily where we deal. There is Central Labs and Red Deer. You can drop samples there as well. So to kind of give you a basic chemistry of what the water is looking like. So yeah.
Did you find with the study that the producers, now if I was asking you to come out, I'd probably pick pastures that look pretty good for you. I wouldn't want to be embarrassed with some of mine. So did you find that there's some things you feel that you consider a little more that maybe didn't get captured because the pastures ended up being relatively well managed, less overgrazing, or
Yeah.
did you run into regrazing regrowth in your analysis too?
Yeah, we did. So definitely it varied into how, you know, the level of management and each operation, I would say, varied. There were some very good grass managers and some, you could say, the standard where they just turned out for the summer and they didn't look at them again until the fall. So some pastures, I would say too, we sampled and nothing had been out. And then when we went back in, it had been grazed once, and then when we went back in for our third period, it had been grazed again. So some of it, like some of the pastures, you could say stayed almost in a vegetative state throughout most of the summer, depending on kind of how it was managed. And some didn't, and some went straight into reproductive stage. There were some pastures, I would say, pretty well all of them had been utilized, had been grazed at least once. We did, I'd say, a challenge of the study has been, for the most part, we were able to keep consistency in the pastures that we sampled, but there has been a few that the producer, for whatever reason, say, turned it up and seeded crop, or cut it for hay because they needed it for hay. So there was some challenges, not very many, but that was a challenge that we kind of came across over the last few years as well.
So with 1 year of the study to go, then I don't know if we said we'd do another webinar with you. So hopefully we'll be able to capture some more information.
Yeah,
as you round
I think we
things out.
definitely have committed to that and happy to do it.
For sure. Yeah, no, we'd be happy to share with you guys year 3 data when we get it. You bet. So kind of put the whole picture together. So
Awesome. Any other questions for Courtney, please? Take advantage of an opportunity to get a free nutrition advice for your pastures.
Yeah, you bet. Courtney, did you find in the areas where you gather data, do you find much in the way of deviation from a kind of a reasonable narrow band with respect to a bunch of the different producers that you sample?
yeah, like definitely even within it would range geographically from the north to the south end of the province, and even within that same area, it definitely would vary kind of in how it was managed. So I would say there was definitely similarity in the forages that we were sampling for the area, but it definitely was, I would say, a good range or an average, you could say, of the producers in the area. So for sure.
So it might be hard to know exactly how you pull those statistics together to get what you call good numbers, sort of.
Yeah, and how we sampled, everything was sampled the same. The number of samples was the same. So it's still, it's not in a box and I can manage each operation as my own to take the samples as it would be, say, in a lab. But it's just the reality, I guess, of field research sometimes, and the differences in fields and pastures and producers, but definitely how we collected the samples and the timing, everything that we could control, we did. So yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Courtney?
Did you know whether or not the producers had done any fertilizing or anything in that management wise?
Yeah, no, we did ask the question, and I would say I'm pretty sure 99% these were not fertilized. I'd have to confirm with Abby for sure, Andrea, and I can send you a note back if it's any different, but I'm fairly confident none of it was fertilized. So
Thanks.
But it was a question that was asked if there was any kind of foliar applications or fertilizer or anything like that. So yeah.
So there's going to be some more data as you pull together the final stages of another year, and some of the questions, just like Andrea asked, will be in the write-up that comes.
Yeah. You betcha.
Okay. All right. Well, if no more questions, then we're going to thank Courtney so much for coming on and providing the information she did. And with that, we'll say that our next session is going to be on June the 11th, and we'll have an announcement and a email out to members and such to try to bring awareness for that session when it occurs. So remember, if anybody else missed the session, you can let them know it's going to be available, as Amanda had said, on the website. So it will be there. And Courtney's been so nice to put her phone number and email on here. So if there's other questions to involve Blue Rock Minerals, we selfishly would say thank you, Courtney, for
No, for sure.
agreeing to support that further.
Yes, you
So,
betcha.
all right. I guess that'll be the end of the webinar for tonight. So thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you everybody for joining. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the near future.
Thanks,
Sounds
Grant.
good. Thanks, everyone.